pitchforks against plate armor, farmers facing down mounted warriors, and victories that changed history. Medieval peasants weren't helpless victims cowering before armored knights. When pushed too far, they became a force that terrified the nobility and toppled kingdoms.
God help us.
Forget Hollywood's version of helpless serfs getting trampled by cavalry charges. The real story involves cunning tactics, brutal weapons, and peasant armies that sent knights running for their lives. Once you see how peasants actually fought back, every medieval movie will feel like aristocratic propaganda. Hollywood shows peasants with nothing but crude pitchforks facing down fully armored knights, but real peasant warfare was way more sophisticated. These weren't helpless farmers. They were people who spent their lives working with tools designed to cut, smash, and pierce. Turns out those same skills translate pretty well to combat. The most effective peasant weapon wasn't some fancy sword, it was the crossbow. Here's why this mattered. A crossbow could punch through a knight's armor from 200 yards away, and any peasant could learn to use one effectively in a few weeks. No years of training, no expensive equipment, just point and shoot. Knights spent decades mastering mounted combat, only to get dropped by a farmer who'd been practicing for a month. Flails weren't just grain-threshing tools, they became knight killers. The chain and weight design meant you could swing around shields and deliver devastating blows to helmeted heads. Knights trained to defend against swords and spears, not agricultural equipment that moved in unpredictable patterns. A well-swung flail could cave in a helmet or break arms right through armor. Billhooks and glaives were basically farming tools with attitude. Originally designed for cutting brush and harvesting, these long-handled weapons gave peasants reach and leverage against mounted opponents. More importantly, they were cheap to make and easy to learn. You didn't need a master weaponsmith. Any village blacksmith could turn farming tools into effective weapons. But here's the really clever part. Peasants used weapons knights couldn't counter because they'd never trained against them. Military education focused on proper weapons used by other nobles. Nobody bothered teaching knights how to fight against modified farm equipment, because who'd be crazy enough to attack a knight with a grain flail? The answer? Desperate people with nothing left to lose. And desperation, it turns out, makes for pretty effective tactical innovation. Fire was another peasant favorite. Knights might be protected against swords, but plate armor becomes an oven when you're surrounded by burning buildings. Peasants would torch barns, houses, even entire villages to flush out occupying forces. Can't fight what you can't catch, and heavy armor doesn't help much when everything around you is on fire. Movies love showing individual peasants challenging knights to honorable combat. In reality, peasants fought smart, not fair. They understood something Hollywood forgets: numbers and tactics beat individual skill when you use them right. Ambush warfare was peasant specialty number one. Knights excelled in open battlefield combat, so peasants simply refused to fight on those terms. Instead, they'd attack supply trains, isolated patrols, and knights separated from their support. A single knight might dominate 10 peasants in open combat, but that same knight becomes a dead man when 50 peasants surround him in a forest. Pit traps were devastatingly effective against cavalry. Peasants would dig concealed holes, sometimes with sharpened stakes at the bottom, along roads frequently traveled by mounted knights. A horse hitting one of these traps doesn't just fall, it usually breaks legs and pins the rider underneath. Suddenly, that terrifying mounted warrior becomes a helpless target for peasant weapons. Bridge destruction was psychological warfare as much as tactical. Knights depended on mobility, especially heavy cavalry. Destroy the bridges, block the roads with fallen trees, and you've turned a knight's greatest advantage into a liability. Now they're stuck on foot, weighed down by armor, trying to navigate terrain peasants know intimately. Night attacks were absolutely brutal. Knights couldn't sleep in full armor, and peasant raiders would hit camps in the dead of night when targets were vulnerable. No honor, no warning, just brutal efficiency. A knife in the dark works just as well on a knight as anyone else. Siege tactics worked in reverse too. Instead of trying to break into fortified positions, peasants would surround them and wait. Knights might control the castle, but peasants controlled the food supply. Cut off supplies long enough and even the mightiest fortress becomes a tomb. The key was understanding that knights were optimized for specific types of combat. Change the rules, and their advantages disappear fast. Here's what Hollywood never shows. Medieval peasants vastly outnumbered the nobility. We're talking hundreds of peasants for every knight in most regions. When you're facing those odds, individual combat skill becomes pretty much irrelevant. Peasant uprisings succeeded through sheer overwhelming force. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw tens of thousands of farmers march on London. Knights couldn't charge through crowds that thick. Horses refused to run into solid walls of people. Instead, heavily armoured cavalry became sitting ducks for crossbow bolts and thrown weapons. Terrain knowledge was a massive peasant advantage. Knights trained for battlefield combat on relatively flat, open ground. Peasants lived and worked in forests, hills and marshland. They knew every hidden path, every muddy patch that would bog down a horse, every stream crossing that could turn into a death trap. Marshland was particularly deadly for knights. Heavy armour and horses don't mix well with swampy ground. Peasants would lure cavalry into boggy areas where horses would get stuck and riders couldn't manoeuvre. What should have been a glorious cavalry charge turned into a slaughter as armoured knights floundered helplessly in the mud. Forest warfare completely negated knightly advantages. Can't charge cavalry through dense trees. Can't use long weapons effectively in confined spaces. Can't see ambushes coming until it's too late. Peasants turned their homeland into a weapon against invaders. But the real peasant advantage was desperation. Knights fought for honour, glory and political gain. Peasants fought because the alternative was watching their families starve or die. That kind of motivation makes people do incredible things and absolutely terrifying things to their enemies. When you've got nothing left to lose, taking down a knight stops being intimidating and starts being necessary survival. Hollywood focuses on dramatic battles, but peasants won through economic warfare that never makes it into movies. The medieval system depended entirely on peasant labour. Stop working and the whole structure collapses. Labour strikes were devastatingly effective. Knights might own the land legally, but they couldn't farm it themselves. When peasants refused to work, either through organised resistance or simply fleeing to other regions, noble wealth dried up fast. No crops, no income, no ability to maintain armies or equipment. Tax resistance was another powerful weapon. Peasants would hide crops, underreport harvests, or simply refuse to pay tribute. What's a knight going to do? Burn down the very farms that generate his wealth? Destroy the peasants who grow his food? That's not warfare, that's economic suicide. Supply line disruption was perhaps the most effective tactic. Medieval armies depended on regular supply trains bringing food, weapons and equipment. Peasants would ambush these convoys, steal supplies and disappear back into familiar terrain. An army without supplies becomes a liability, not an asset. Market manipulation worked too. Peasants controlled food production and could artificially create shortages in areas controlled by hostile nobles. Knights might win battles, but they couldn't eat victory. A starving garrison doesn't hold territory very long. The brilliance was in understanding that the medieval economy was a weapon that peasants controlled. Knights depended on peasant cooperation far more than peasants depended on knightly protection. Remove that cooperation and the whole feudal system starts falling apart. This economic pressure often worked better than direct military confrontation. Much harder to fight back against people who simply refuse to cooperate with your authority. When peasants successfully fought back against knights, they didn't just win individual battles, they shattered the entire myth of noble invincibility. These victories proved that armour, training and bloodline meant nothing when faced with organised, desperate people who understood their own power. The psychological impact was enormous. Knights based their authority on the idea that they were naturally superior warriors, blessed by God and trained from birth for combat. When farmers started killing knights with farming tools, that whole ideology crumbled. Suddenly, the nobility looked a lot less divine and a lot more vulnerable. Successful peasant uprisings forced real political changes. The English Peasants' Revolt, the German Peasants' War, countless smaller rebellions, each one extracted concessions from the nobility. Reduced taxes, expanded rights, limits on noble authority. These weren't temporary victories that got reversed later. They were permanent shifts in the balance of power. Economic changes were just as significant. The Black Death killed so many peasants that survivors gained unprecedented bargaining power. Suddenly, lords who used to dictate terms were begging peasants to work their land. Wages rose, working conditions improved, and the whole feudal system started adapting to peasant demands. Military tactics evolved too. Nobles realized they needed different strategies when facing peasant armies. Traditional cavalry charges became suicidal against massed crossbows and pike formations. Knights started fighting on foot, using different weapons, developing new approaches to siege warfare. Perhaps most importantly, peasant resistance established the principle that authority has limits. When rulers push too hard, people push back. That concept, revolutionary for its time, laid the groundwork for later democratic movements and concepts of popular sovereignty. The lesson was clear: power that depends on cooperation is ultimately fragile. Knights could dominate individual peasants, but they couldn't dominate entire populations that refused to accept their authority. And once that truth became obvious, the medieval world was never the same. Peasant victories weren't just military triumphs. They were proof that ordinary people could challenge seemingly insurmountable power and win. That knowledge, once unleashed, changed everything about how medieval society understood authority, resistance, and the relationship between rulers and the ruled. Medieval peasants didn't just fight back against knights, they rewrote the rules of medieval society. Their victories proved that determination, organization, and desperation could overcome training, equipment, and aristocratic privilege. Those farmers with their converted farming tools didn't just kill individual knights. They killed the idea that some people are born to rule and others born to obey. And that might be the most revolutionary victory of all. The pitchfork wasn't just a weapon, it was a declaration that power belongs to whoever has the courage to seize it.